In the last edition of Project Quad, we assembled the airframe, wired our electronics, tested the radio, set the proper rotation of our motors, and calibrated the ESCs. Today we've got one last step before we can take our quad on its maiden flight, configuring the flight controller. Unlike most other controllers, the KK 2.1.5 has its own screen, meaning that you don't have to connect it to a laptop or mobile device to change settings. As you grow more comfortable with flying and dialing in your configuration, you can move to more feature-filled flight controllers like my personal favorite, the Flip MWC. But for the novice, there's nothing like the KK's ability to let you tweak your flight characteristics in the field with no extra gear. Power up your quad, and the KK board should be at its safe screen. The 4 buttons below the screen from left to right are back, up, down, and enter. Hit enter to drop into the menu. The first step is to load the proper motor layout. This tells the controller how many motors it has to use and what their positions are relative to the controller. Use the down key to navigate to Load Motor Layout and hit enter. You'll see a menu of preloaded configurations that include single and dual rotor helicopters, tricopters, septicopters, octocopters, plus mode quads, and of course, our X mode configuration quadcopter. Navigate to Quadcopter X mode and hit enter. You'll be asked to confirm your decision and hit yes. The screen should change to show the motor layout, including the required motor rotation. If you followed our tutorial in the last Project Quad segment, then your quad will match the on-screen layout. But this is an excellent reference screen if you ever need to reassemble your quad. Next, we need to configure the onboard accelerometers. Navigate to ACC Calibration and hit enter. Make sure that your quad is on a solid, level surface and that it's free from vibration. Hit continue. Then don't touch the quad again until calibration is complete. Now we want to configure the self-level control. Navigate to Mode Settings and hit Enter. The first entry should be labeled Self-Level and it should read AUX or Auxiliary. This means that you can use an auxiliary channel on your transmitter to turn the KK self-leveling feature on and off at will. You can also use Stick and activate or deactivate the self-level with a stick command, but I don't recommend it unless you only have 4 channels. If you wired your quad as specified in the last Project Quad segment, then channel 5 should be the on-off switch for self-leveling. If you're using the FlySky T6 transmitter and you want to reassign self-leveling to a more convenient input, then watch our segment on transmitters. The last setting we want to configure is the auto level itself. Navigate to self-level and hit enter. For most, the default value should work fine on a 250 class quad, but I like to turn down my P gains to between 30 and 60. The P gain will regulate how quickly the controller will try to level the craft, and too high of a P gain can cause oscillation, as the craft constantly overcorrects its level. Before we get into the air, let's do a quick check of our handiwork to make sure that the quad will respond as we think it will. Put your quad on a level surface and turn on your transmitter. Connect the battery to the ESCs and verify that the KK has booted into safe mode. Position yourself so that you are behind and above your quad, with the front of the craft pointing away from you. Now arm the controller by moving the throttle to 0 and pushing the stick to the right. You should hear a beep and see the arming light turn on. Toggle your auxiliary channel number 5 and see if the self-level turns on and off. You'll want self-leveling off for the following test. Take a few step backs, then give your quad about 20% throttle. You want to spin up the props but not take off. If you start to leave the ground, reduce throttle. Look for any uncontrolled vibrations or wobbles. Now move the right stick forward slightly until you see the craft start to tilt forward. Be gentle. You're just checking input. You don't want to flip your quad. Move the stick back and see if it rocks back on the landing gear. Now move to the left and to the right, checking to see if the quad leans in that direction. Lastly, move the left stick right and left to see if the craft will rotate in the right direction. If any of these inputs fail to cause the expected action, then you need to check your transmitter for reversed channels and your wiring for incorrect connections. Run through the last Project Quad segment again and check those connections. When you're done testing inputs, move the throttle to 0% and to the left. This will disarm the controller. Make sure to do this before you ever pick up your quad, otherwise you risk the prop spinning up if you tap the throttle. Once you're satisfied that the quad will respond properly to your inputs while in the air, it's time for your maiden flight. Confirm that your KK is on in the safe screen, then flip your auxiliary channel to turn self-leveling on. Once again, stand a safe distance behind your quad with the front of the craft pointed away from you, arm the craft, and bring the throttle to about 30%. Let it spin up, then continue to advance the throttle until your craft leaves the ground. Your controller should keep the craft level as it lifts off. If it starts to wobble, oscillate, or careen out of control, chop the throttle. You can fix your quad, you may not be able to fix what it runs into. Assuming that there were no problems, let the quad rise until it's about 4 feet off the ground. Modulate your throttle to keep your quad at the same altitude while you use the right stick to hold position. You want to use small, constant inputs. Always be adjusting the flight of your quad without large control inputs. You've probably just encountered the first challenge to flying, the ground effect. The prop wash creates a cushion of turbulence near the ground. The bigger the props, the bigger the cushion. As a result, the air near the ground is choppy and unpredictable. You'll get a much smoother ride once you're above that layer, about 4 feet. Hover. A lot. Use an entire battery or 12 to practice hovering. You can vary your altitude, but always keep it low enough so that chopping the throttle won't cause extensive damage. Note that your quad will be unstable if you try to bring it straight down. That's because it has to fly through the turbulence it's creating. If you want a smoother flight, always descend while moving. It doesn't feel like much, but you're learning the characteristics of your new quad, and your brain is learning how to control your fingers to keep the quad where you want it to be. At first, you should be practicing 3 inputs: elevator, aileron, and throttle. The yaw or rudder should be left alone. Keep the quad's rear pointed towards you, and don't worry about rotating your craft just yet. Mix up the hovering practice with an occasional landing. Landing sounds easy, but the problem is the aforementioned ground effect. As your quad gets closer to landing, it will want to hover just a few inches off the ground, even as you reduce throttle. Pick your landing spot, reduce throttle until you hit the ground effect, correct your angle to keep your landing spot, then quickly reduce throttle to drop through the ground effect. Once you've mastered takeoff, hovering, and landing, it's time to try something a bit more challenging: walking the quad. Find yourself an open stretch of field or a wide abandoned street. Take off and place your quad in front of you about 5 feet away. Now start walking and keep your quad at the same distance from you as you walk. You're training your brain to handle multi-vector spatial reasoning. In other words, your brain is learning how to adjust the flight of your quad while you are moving. Use another dozen or so batteries to walk the quad. Once you're comfortable with basic movement, practice moving your quad from left to right, all the while keeping it within your practice radius. When that becomes easy, practice rotating the quad a complete 360 degrees as quickly as you can while it's stationary, making sure to manage the throttle to keep altitude. Once walking the quad becomes second nature, it's time to move on to the circle of death. Okay, it's not really a circle of death, but it's a good way to add yaw into your practice. You've been using the throttle, elevator, and aileron in your practice thus far, but we haven't actively rotated the craft while moving. The circle changes that. Take off and push your quad about 10 feet from you. Now, without moving from the spot you're standing in, start to slowly turn your body while keeping the quad in front of you, with its rear always facing your body. In order to do this, you're going to have to use all 4 controls. On the right stick, you'll have to move left or right to keep the quad in front of you, and forward and back to keep it a safe distance from your body. On the left stick, you'll need to use the yaw to slowly rotate the craft in order to keep its rear pointed at you, and the throttle to hold altitude as you turn. Start slowly, then pick up the pace as you get accustomed to the control combination. If you start to get overwhelmed, stop your rotation and reset the quad a safe distance before starting again. Once you're comfortable with these exercises, you can move on to more challenging flight.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
too fantastic to believe. Nobody will believe the invasion of the Saucer Men.
That looks like a piece of propeller.
Yeah, I have extras.